Isagi and Nagi, a nobody and a genius. Based on their placements in Blue Lock and their interactions before and during the Team V vs Z match, they'd probably seem like they're on two completely different sides of the spectrum. But there is one giant aspect of their characters in which they share that shapes their journeys. They both had yet to find their ego. In Blue Lock, a main goal is to develop one's ego, and we see different sides of this. Let's take Raichi, Chigiri, and Machida. Raichi already had his ego, Chigiri rediscovered his, and Bachira's, which was shaped. But Isagi and Nagi had yet to find theirs. But what did they have? The Agi boys were very different in their journeys to get to where we see them at the end of Season 1 of Blue Lock. Let's look at Isagi. We can see that he played soccer since a kid, being inspired by the players you'd see on TV, especially the greatest forward, Noel Noah. In the game we see him playing at the start of the show, he managed his way down the field well enough. After all, he may have been the second worst ranking when he first got to Blue Lock, but he was still good enough to be invited in the first place. That being said, when he got close to the goal, he didn't shoot. His teammate was open, and his coach shouted to him to remember, all for one and one for all. In Yoichi, he would take heed, remembering the lessons instilled into him. After all, soccer is a team sport, a game predicated on teams of 11. He can win if he passes. His team can win. And so he does. And his teammate hits post. He passed. He thought about the team. But in trying to get his team to nationals, he suppressed his own desire to be the one to take them there. But they didn't make it anyway. So he stood with his team after the game, listening to some spiel he didn't care about, listening to his teammates act as if the one who missed the shot didn't lose in the game in the end, and stewing in his own self-frustration for passing. As he reflected on the game on his way back home, his frustration forced itself out of his throat, as he yelled in an unfruitful reach for catharsis. His lack of ego leads him to unyielding frustration.
Remember, it's one for all, and all for one.
Hey, what do you think's up with that guy?
Because soccer is a sport
acting
played by
pretty
teams
weird.
of 11. You can't do it alone. Damn it. I really wanted to win.
And now, Seishiro Nagi. He lives alone, only having a plant in terms of their life in his home. He can be found sleeping in class just about every day. He keeps to himself, playing video games instead of socializing. And why does he live this way? Because he's lazy. He finds everything to be a hassle. A cactus is his social limit, paying attention in class is too boring, and games are way more interesting than trying to socialize with people. That's Seishiro Nagi. He sounds more like a hermit, but a genius though? Well, you would think the same after seeing what Mikage-ryo saw. One day he bumped into Nagi, causing him to drop his phone, and in response, he sprung from his sitting position, catching and balancing the phone on his foot before it could hit the ground. And also he didn't die in his game. And what's more, he never played a game of soccer in his life. A true prodigy, and Mikage-ryo's treasure. We see much more of the Sloth Boy's journey in the episode Nagi spin-off. Nagi would clutch a match in his first ever game, which was against a strong high school. And off that match alone, he and Io would be considered for the Blue Lock program. A genius without ego, and without a care for something as boring as victory.
Who is this guy?
Well, that was easy. I don't know why you had such a hard time.
He's not human. This guy's a monster too.
Both Isagi and Nagi would be invited to the Blue Lock. While this does mean they were both good enough to be invited, their skill level was definitely on two completely different planes. And so were their personalities and drive. Cut to Jinpachi Ego's speech. A call to all strikers with the intent of riling up their festering egos and drawing them in like sharks to blood. A speech that went against the values instilled in most all who have played a soccer if not any sport, one to encourage self-reflection and to take a look at one's own ego. A challenge that would draw in any striker. After all, he's offering them a spot at the place where soccer is the most intense. And that is exactly where strikers belong. That's exactly why Isagi instinctively ran to face the challenge, being the first to truly resonate and act on what was being said. Though, while he was the first, Nagi was the last. The call of the striker to embrace ego had called to Isagi. He wanted the challenge, the chance to be reborn. But as for Nagi, nothing but the speech interested him. Ego's words about not hesitating to shoot, listening to Ego, due to him seeing everything as either easy or dull, he wasn't stricken by the speech, because he believed it would have been easy to do so. As in, he had no problem envisioning winning the World Cup. And while Ego was delighted by the flood of unpolished gems or diamonds in the rough rushing toward Blue Lock, after Nagi explained why he didn't want to attend the program, thinking he'd probably just get bored of it, Ego stated he didn't think Nagi could make it to the cup, nor did he want him in this program anyway. He himself says that Nagi doesn't understand his ego, and he writes him off as a self-conscious, overgrown bastard who just doesn't want to get hurt, and that he doesn't belong in Blue Lock. And while Nagi doesn't give two shits, Reo wouldn't accept it, declaring he'd make Nagi the best in the world. His ego. And he promised Nagi that he'd keep him entertained. That was enough to convince him, as long as Reo promised they'd be together till the end. Ironic. But this is important. Reo is the reason Nagi had to continue on. In fact, the reason he started the sport in the first place. A player that pushed him, with Nagi being the player that Reo wanted nothing more than to play with. A relationship mirrored by Isagi and Bachira. It is in the stretch to call the two partners, same with Nagi and Reo. Even more with those two, actually. Bachira found in Isagi the player he'd been looking for all his life. A real-life monster that could excite him. Reo claimed Nagi as his treasure. A bona fide genius that he wanted to make the very best. Both Reo and Bachira turned their partner into their reasons for playing. A decision which had obvious repercussions later on for both. But what about the Agi boys? Well, for Isagi, Bachira was a player that lit a fire in him, as well as his partner in crime. For Nagi, Reo is the reason for playing. We see how Bachira affects Isagi, even from their first conversation after the game of tag. Isagi says that despite how strange he finds Bachira, he's able to stoke his fire and give him courage. Not to mention, he's the one who fed him the pass for his first goal in Blue Lock, as well as the one that would lead to him discovering his direct shot and being reborn. Their chemical reaction cannot be denied. As for Reo and Nagi, as I said before, Reo's the reason Nagi even picked up the sport. And no matter how much he may complain during a game, if Reo says to Nagi, score this many goals, he'll do it. Not because he's Reo's slave, but he's his partner. Though, the Agi boys' partners don't only push them in their presence, but just as well in their absence, as in the third selection, both would lose their partner. But before we go into that, let's go back a bit to Isagi and Nagi's first interactions. Right before Team V and Z's match, Nagi talks down to Kuon after he tries to sell out his team for his own benefit. He says that if he was that weak to have to try that hard, he'd just up and quit altogether. After all, soccer can't really be all that, can it? And while not to stick up for Kuon, Isagi does take offense to that statement, being a player with love for the game, and as such, he tells Nagi not to look down on soccer. Then, there's the interactions they had during the game, in which Nagi took an interest in Isagi. First, wondering what pushed him, as he was genuinely struggling with grasping what soccer was to the ever-struggling Team Z, and even to himself. And after his awakening, which led to him actually making plays, as he was starting to take a genuine interest in soccer, he charged after Isagi, seeing him as a threat. He was the most interesting player on the field to him, though to Isagi, Nagi was just an opponent to be defeated. A genius he wanted to surpass. Instead of a bitter rivalry, an interest was spurred. Isagi's ego was flared in wanting to take down Nagi and Team Z, but a facet of Nagi's ego was awakened in facing the ever-resilient Team Z, and the fellow developing ego who exemplified the team's drive in Isagi. It awakened his curiosity. This led to Nagi's choice of putting the exploration of his ego at the top of his priority list. Like when, in the second selection, even though he and Reo were poised to team up, instead he joined up with Isagi and Bachira. He was interested in Isagi. Reo was able to spur him into action, but Isagi made him want to explore the world of soccer. And so, he left Reo behind, and after the team of Isagi, Bachira, and Nagi was formed, they would quickly after lose Bachira in their first match. Isagi lost his partner. And after a 3-on-3 match between Isagi, Nagi, and Baro versus Reo, Chigiri, and Kunigami, Nagi would see Reo differently. He'd see him as a hassle, simply put. And just like that, he abandoned his former partner, leaving both Isagi and Nagi without their partners. And yet, they still both believed in them, and they were still both motivated by them, if not even more than before. Isagi loves Bachira but never stopped believing in him. Even after witnessing the #1 player that was Rin Itoshi, he was still determined to win back Bachira. Not to mention, the reason he was able to block Bachira's shot post his second awakening was his belief in him as a monster that could go beyond everyone on the field's expectations. As for Nagi, even after choosing to abandon Reo, losing his partner still pushed him. He wanted to do things that would excite him, or else abandoning Reo would be for nothing. He apologized to the fact that he couldn't go back to the way things were after having so much fun with Isagi, but he also held his breath waiting for Reo in the third selection. They both believed in and were motivated by their partners, even after losing them. Having to fight without their other halves helped their ego and skills develop, and said growth of their egos was extremely apparent. Isagi's will to be able to defeat his opponents, not only with his teammates but with his own strength, pushed him as a player and an egoist. Exponentially, I might add, match by match. He became an egoist with an unorthodox playing style, that being to devour not only his opponents but his teammates. And then there was Nagi's fast-developing genius that would create and act on plays to satisfy his curiosity as to what he could do. He truly went to explore this after he lost Reo, to see how much fun he could have with soccer and testing his own limits. Both Isagi and Nagi's developing egos and journeys mirror each other in some ways and are polar opposites in others. But above all, Nagi was right. There was a reason they continued to cross paths in their match, and why they eventually joined the second selection. Their developing egos resonated with each other, and it created a formidable pair of egoists, though one that was broken apart, but nevertheless. What's more, these two egos are still developing, both on the road to becoming the greatest striker. And what will be the result of Nagi's curiosity, of Isagi's gluttony? Well, likely the prize that can only be claimed after climbing atop of the corpses of the fallen rivals defeated to claim the title of the strongest. That being, of course, the World Cup.